What's going on, guys? Today I want to try to answer the question, what exactly is dynamic EQ doing to your sound? Sound good? Let's get into it. Now, you may have seen my previous video where I go over if dynamic EQ is either helping or hurting your sound using a basic SPL meter. Now, if you haven't seen that video, I highly suggest watching that one before this one. I'll leave a card up here so you can check it out if you want to. Now, this video isn't a direct follow-up to that video, but it is a more in-depth look at dynamic EQ and what it's doing to your speakers and sound in your room. And more importantly, what's it actually doing to the EQ of your speakers when you lower the volume? I mean, it is called dynamic EQ for a reason, right? Now, I won't be doing any real-time measurements as there is a ton of info to go over here. I've already done all the measurements off camera to save this video from being well over an hour, trust me. I will explain the measurements and the reasoning behind them when we jump into Room EQ Wizard, but just know that I tested and measured both dynamic EQ off for a reference or baseline measurement, if you will, as well as all four reference level offset settings with dynamic EQ turned on at various volume levels, both because I was curious to see what they did, as well as trying to answer some of the most common questions in regards to reference level offset and which one you might want to use if you want to use dynamic EQ at all. But before we dive into Room EQ Wizard, if you're new here, please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already, as I post new home theater and gaming related content every single week. Also, if you'd like to support the channel for free, please consider using my Amazon affiliate links in the description below. And if you enjoy listening to podcasts about home theater and gaming like I do, then feel free to check out the Fun Waste of Time podcast on your favorite music streaming services. It's where me and a group of friends get together and talk about gaming, home theater, comic books, and, well, anything that's considered a fun way to waste your day. Links for that are in the description below. Now, without further ado, let's jump into Room EQ Wizard. Alright, so now we are here in REW, and let me tell you what I got set up here, what I got going on. So basically, I did 3 different measurements of 3 different channels. I did the left front, the center, and the right surround. I didn't do the right front and the left surround just because as we do the left front, the right front's pretty much going to have the same type of dynamic EQ applied to it. Same with the left surround. You know, we're measuring the right surround, the left surround's pretty much going to have the same thing. But I did want to do the center because I wasn't exactly sure if dynamic EQ treats the center channel differently, and I just wanted to verify that. So we're going to go over that. So we have the left front to go over, the center, and the right surround. Now, I did a bunch of different measurements on each, and I'll run through those real quick. So basically, I did 6 different volume measurements. I started out at minus 25 dB, went to minus 20, went to minus 15, went to, you get it. So all the way up to 0 dB. And I did that 5 different times. Once with dynamic EQ completely off, again with dynamic EQ on at 0 dB reference level offset, and then again at 5, 10, and 15 reference level offset. So we can kind of see exactly what's going on as we change that depending on our volume level. And the way I'm going to go over it is I'm just going to separate it by volume level. So we're going to go by minus 25, minus 20, so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and dive right in. So here we have the left channel with dynamic EQ completely off. Now, don't really pay attention to the frequency response in the room. That's not really what we're looking at. What we're looking at is what kind of adjustments is dynamic EQ making to the overall frequency response, and is it making it sound unbalanced? Is the bass going to be too much? Etc., so on and so forth. So if I just go through all of the dynamic EQ adjustments and turn them on, what you should see here is basically an increase in volume that's equal each time. So this is, 5 dB higher, this is 5 dB higher, and we shouldn't see any weird kind of crazy fluctuations. We might see some minor fluctuations just as volume variance and stuff like that comes into play. But this looks like a pretty good and pretty even increase in volume. We're going to use the minus 25 dB with dynamic EQ off as our baseline. And so this is pretty much what you'd expect at minus 25 dB. Everything's kind of level. I do have the subs running a little hot. So if I turn on the measurement with dynamic EQ on at reference level offset of 0, as you can see here, it's made a major change already. It starts making adjustments, it looks like around the 800 hertz mark. We can start to see this deviate from that initial measurement with dynamic EQ off. And as it goes down, it gets higher and higher. Now, if we go down here to around, let's say 40 Hertz, with no dynamic EQ, we're at about 71 decibels. Now with dynamic EQ, look at this, we're up to 81. So that is a 10 decibel increase, and that can create an unbalanced sound, especially if you're listening that low. Now, as we see, if we go up here, now we can kind of taper off it, and you know, it's accentuating the highs a little bit, but you're probably really not going to notice much up here. You might notice a little bit more clarity, but it's actually going to be hard to hear that clarity over the massive increase and boost in the bass response. So that's something we definitely don't want. I personally don't want that. So now if we turn on the reference level offset at 5 with dynamic EQ on, you should notice it decreased in volume, because basically we're moving that point at which dynamic EQ says, hey, don't do anything anymore. So before, at reference level offset of 0, at 0 dB, it's not doing anything. But as soon as you start lowering that volume, it starts to do stuff. Basically, we're seeing a reduction overall. Now, it's not gonna be linear. It's not gonna look exactly like you're going 5 dB down, because it is dynamic EQ. It's doing things differently each time depending on the reference level offset. But as we can see, we're down here, or we're getting closer to this here, which is kind of what we want. We don't want it to sound extremely unbalanced. So if we turn on the reference level offset of 10, you should see again, we're going down here. And you'll notice if I turn these other two off, that it's becoming more in line with the reference measurement here, which was dynamic EQ off. And now if we just finally turn on reference level offset of 15, again, it's even further down. Now if I turn on all of these, you'll see just this nice, you know, slope downward there. If we look at this, it's much, much closer to our measurement with dynamic EQ off. Now, if you were to listen to movies at -25 a lot, a reference level offset of 15 might actually be what you want. Now, if we move over to the -20, here's again our reference measurement, dynamic EQ off, and we're pretty much going to see the same thing. At -20 and reference level offset of 0 dB, we're seeing that same increase. Now you see it's a little bit less severe as the other one if we return both of these on, because there's just not that much of a gap in the volume between 0 dB, which is not doing anything, and -20. Now if we do reference level offset of 5, you'll see it comes down again. Same with 10 and 15. So we're getting closer and closer to that reference level. If we look at this, again, if you listen at -20, you're probably pretty good leaving it on a reference level offset of 15. Now moving over to -15 dB, again, here's our reference measurement. We'll hit 0. Okay, now we're seeing even less of an increase in overall output down here. It's still there, it's still quite a bit. But I mean, if we look here, we're at 82, and then we go up here, and we're still at 88, 89. So that's almost a 7 decibel increase, which is still a lot. It's still gonna sound pretty unbalanced. But again, as we turn on these other measurements, because we're at 15, it's pretty much not doing anything, as you see here. But something really interesting starts to happen. If you have this set at reference level offset of 15 and you bring your volume above that, watch what happens. So we're gonna go over here to -10 dB. This is our reference measurement. If we look at the reference level offset of 0, you know, we're starting to see that gap close. Same with if we had it set at 5, and then at 10, it's not doing anything, pretty much. So here's where that interesting part comes in. So you have your reference level offset set to 15. Here's our reference measurement, dynamic EQ off, and then here is our measurement below that at reference level offset of 15. And we're at -10 decibels below reference on the receiver. Normally we'd be at 86, 87. We're now at 85. So we lost about 4 decibels. 2 to 3 decibels. I can't do math. I haven't had coffee today. So you're actually losing output, and it's only going to get worse, as you'll see once I go to the next 2 measurements, or the next set of measurements. So at -5 dB, turning that reference level offset to 0, we're seeing a little increase, but not too much. This would be pretty much negligible, right? And then as we get to, you know, -5, it's not doing anything. But now, if for some reason you wanted to listen at -5 and you had your reference level offset set to 10, you're losing output. You got output normally with no dynamic EQ, and then with dynamic EQ on, you're now losing output. But it gets even worse if you're on the reference level offset of 15. So we're now losing a ton of output here. If we turn this off, we're going from 91 and a half, 90, let's say just 92, down to, 87. So that is a 5 decibel decrease in overall output, and you're also still losing that in the upper area as well. This is definitely something you don't want to do, is if you listen at those volume levels outside of that range of the reference level offset that you set. And so finally, if we go to dynamic EQ off at 0 dB, which you can see is kind of loud, obviously. Basically, none of these, the first one, the reference level offset set to 0, is going to do nothing. But we turn on the 5, losing output. Turn on the 10, losing even more output. Turning on the 15, we're losing a ton of output. Now, personally, I don't listen to movies or music at 0 dB. It's just too loud for me. It becomes fatiguing. But if you were to just leave your reference level offset at 15, maybe not realizing it, you're actually losing a ton of bass output here, and some high frequencies as well. I mean, we're going, with it on, we're looking at about 88, and with it off, we're looking at about 90. So that's a 2 to 3 decibel decrease in overall output. So let's go ahead and move on to the center channel here. So here I have the center channel file opened up, and I basically did all the same things that I did with the left front. Let's start out with our dynamic EQ off measurement at minus 25 decibels. Again, we're gonna kind of see the same trend here as we did with the front left. So we have this massive increase in bass output. This is reference level 0, same volume level, massive increase in bass output, and then a little bit increase in the overall highs. Now, as we obviously start to turn on the 5, it's gonna go down a little bit, just moving that point. Same with 10, we're going down, and then 15. So if we go over to minus 20, again, we're gonna see the same trend. Reference level offset 0, still got that massive increase, not as much as it was before because we went up 5 decibels, and it's readjusting. We're getting closer to 0, so it's gonna tame that a little bit. We're still getting that increase in the highs. But again, the trend is, the other 3, 5, 10, and 15 reference level offset, we're gonna see this decrease in the boost that it does to the bass and the highs. So moving on to minus 15 below reference with dynamic EQ off, 0 dB, still got that massive boost up here, and then still up here. Looking at reference level offset of 5, gonna see that decrease is gonna come down a little bit, and then 10, see that decrease, and then 15 should be like for like, right? Yeah, pretty much. It's just disabled at that point. Okay, moving on to minus 10. Again, here's our reference measurement, no dynamic EQ. Dynamic EQ on, reference level offset 0. We're starting to see that boost kind of come closer. That gap is narrowing. Same if we went to 5. We're gonna see it pretty much right in the middle, but as we, hit 10, that's gonna be like for like. And just like the left front, if we have it set to 15, we're actually losing output if we're listening at minus 10. So moving on to minus 5 dB, reference measurement here, turning on dynamic EQ, reference level offset 0. Well, we see a little, a little boost there and a little boost here. And then as we turn on minus 5, or the 5 reference level offset, pretty much like for like. If we have it set to reference level offset at 10, definitely losing output, don't want that. And 15 reference level offset, way lower. And then finally, with it set to 0, here's our bass measurement, no dynamic EQ, reference level offset set to 0, dynamic EQ on, like for like, it's not doing anything. But we go to 5, okay, we're losing output, and then 10 and 15, losing a ton of output. So as you can see, definitely don't use these two and really crank it up. Well, even the 5, if you listen at minus 5 decibels below reference, you'd be okay, but keep it at reference level offset of 5. If you go to 10 or 15, you're now losing output. So definitely something to consider. So definitely take a look and see how these areas here are still pretty much like for like. They're not really being boosted a whole ton in this middle region. It's not like the whole thing is going up 3 dB. It's pretty much in line, and then it'll boost that. We ran through all of that. Now let's go to the right surround. All right, so now I have the right surround file opened up in REW, and we're looking at the bass measurement here, minus 25 decibels below reference with no dynamic EQ. So if we go ahead and turn on dynamic EQ with reference level offset of 0, look at what happens. Remember on the front channels, we saw an increase in the bass about up here, but then up here kind of leveled off and stayed the same. Now we're seeing an overall volume increase across the board. So instead of just boosting the bass, we're now boosting the channels, the surround channels at least, well above what they should be. And if we look here, you know, we're at 70, let's say 71 decibels. And then we come up here, we're at 76, which is why if, you know, you're listening with dynamic EQ on at just a stock reference level offset of 0, which is what everything defaults to, then your system is going to sound incredibly unbalanced. But the problem is you can't really adjust for it. You can't just bring your SPL level down, because anytime you change the volume, it's going to be different. That's why they call it dynamic EQ. So if we, you know, go down the other 3, the 5, 10, and 15 reference level offsets, we're going to see the same trend as we did before. We're seeing that just, you know, come down each time because we're moving that point at which dynamic EQ doesn't do anything, from 0 to 5 to 10 and 15. So if we move on to minus 20 dB reference measurement here, no dynamic EQ, again, we're gonna see just that overall boost in volume across the board, and we're still seeing that, you know, that huge spike in the bass. I can't confirm if this is exactly what's happening with the height channels in Atmos, just have no way to test that currently. So if and when REW gets updated or ASIO for all gets updated to support Atmos, then I'll do another video about that. Trucking along here, we're moving down, so basically the same trend. I'm moving downward here, and so moving on to minus 15, reference level measurement, dynamic EQ on, reference level offset to 0, and again, we're seeing that overall increase, and it's just a trend in the surround channels. The left surround channel is the same. So as we, you know, turn on 5 and 10, okay, it's doing the same thing, and then obviously if we turn on 15, it's like for like because it's not doing anything. So moving on to the next measurement, minus 10. Again, here's the bass measurement, no dynamic EQ, reference level offset set to 0 with dynamic EQ on. Still seeing that boost. It's not as severe, you know, that gap is closing. Same with reference level offset set to 5. Gap's even narrower. Now at 10, it's turned off. And just like before, if it's set at 15, reference level offset, and you're listening at minus 10 decibels below reference, or even minus 12 or something like that, you are losing output. You are decreasing bass and your highs a little bit. And it just gets more severe as you move that reference level offset and go up on volume. Moving to a volume of minus 5 dB below reference, no dynamic EQ, turn dynamic EQ on, and now we're seeing a less severe increase. We're still seeing that increase. With this, it's like for like, and again, like before, 10 and 15 reference level offset, we're losing output. And finally, at 0 dB volume, with no dynamic EQ, here's our bass measurement. We turn on dynamic EQ, reference level offset is 0. It's basically identical. If we have 5, 10, and 15 turned on or activated, then we are seeing that massive decrease in output, especially around the bass and the highs here. So again, that's definitely not something you want to do. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw it back to my other version of myself, I guess, and we'll wrap things up. So now that we've gone over all of that, and I know it was a lot of information to process, what's the final takeaway here? Well, if what you're after is a balanced sounding system at any volume level, then not using dynamic EQ is really your only option. Hopefully the measurements you saw in this video made it clear as to what dynamic EQ is actually doing to your sound and speakers. And now the ball's pretty much in your court as to if you want to use it or not. Now, dynamic EQ's functionality does not differ from receiver to receiver. It will do pretty much the same job on any device that has Audyssey room correction. Yes, your speakers in room and Audyssey room correction results will be different, but dynamic EQ's end result is still the same and will apply that same dynamic EQ curve as to what you saw in this video. Ultimately, it comes down to what you think sounds best in your room with your speakers and your ears. For me personally, I'm not a fan of dynamic EQ's muddiness and over excessive bass, and I just simply don't use it in my home theater at all. If you have any questions regarding dynamic EQ, home theater, or gaming in general, please leave a comment down below and let me know. Also, if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up, as it lets me know that you appreciate this type of content. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one where a guy pees on my rug and I try to get a replacement from the other Jeffrey Lebowski.
That rug really tied the room together, did it not?